The dead colony lay silent beneath the twin moons of Veris Prime, its ruins bathed in cold silver light. Zayn Voss stood at the edge of the derelict settlement, the wind tugging at his tattered jacket. The place should have been swarming with life. Miners, traders, settlers carving out an existence on the fringe of explored space. Instead, there was nothing. No bodies. No signs of a fight. Just absence. He exhaled slowly, adjusting the grip on his rifle. The signal had led him here, a faint distress call that barely cut through the static of deep space. He should have ignored it. But something about the way it had flickered in and out, weak and desperate, had drawn him in. Veris Prime was a name whispered in fear across outposts and space stations. The cursed colony. The place where people vanished. A graveyard without bones. Zayn didn't believe in curses, but he did believe in fear. And fear had a way of turning men into monsters. His boots crunched over cracked pavement as he stepped forward, scanning the darkened structures. The buildings, skeletal remains of once thriving homes and markets, stood silent. Dust coated everything, thick and undisturbed. The air was stale, carrying the scent of rust, and something else, something old, something wrong. Then he heard it. A whisper, low and sharp, slicing through the stillness. "No one wants us, stranger." Zayn swung his rifle up, his heart hammering. A figure emerged from the darkness. She was tall, wrapped in the shadows like they belonged to her. Her long black hair cascaded over her shoulders in tangled waves, and her silver eyes gleamed with an unearthly light. Her skin was deep blue, smooth except for the swirling black markings that twisted along her arms and neck like living ink. She was like something from an old legend, a ghost carved into the ruins of a lost civilization. And yet, she was very much alive. A child clung to her side, half hidden beneath the folds of her ragged cloak. He had the same blue skin, the same silver eyes. His small fingers curled into the fabric as he peered at Zayn with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Zayn lowered his rifle, just enough to show he wasn't a threat. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said evenly. The woman didn't move, didn't blink. "They all say that," she murmured, her voice edged with exhaustion too deep for someone so young. Zayn studied her. The way she positioned herself between him and the boy, the quiet tension in her muscles despite her obvious fatigue. She was ready to fight. She had probably been ready for a long time. "You sent the distress signal," he guessed. She hesitated, then gave a small nod. "And the rest of the colony?" A pause. Then, simply, "Gone." Zayn had seen enough battlefields to know when something wasn't right. The quiet was too absolute, too unnatural. Night had fallen over the ruins of Veris Prime, the shadows stretching long and deep. They had made camp in the hollow remains of an old outpost, a flickering fire casting uneasy light against the crumbling walls. The boy, Riel, she had called him, slept wrapped in the woman's cloak. But she, Talia, didn't rest. Neither did Zayn. "How long have they been watching us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Talia didn't look at him. "Since sundown." His jaw tightened. She hadn't said a word about it before now. Either she hadn't trusted him or she hadn't been sure he'd believe her. A twig snapped in the distance. Zayn moved without thinking, his rifle sliding into his hands without a sound. Riel stirred slightly in his sleep. Talia wrapped an arm around him, but her gaze never wavered from the darkness. Another sound, too controlled to be the wind. Zayn exhaled, slow and steady. "They ever get this close before?" Talia turned to him then, her silver eyes flashing with something dark, something unreadable. "They've never come this close, and left witnesses." The shadows shifted. Then they attacked. Something huge erupted from the darkness, moving with unnatural speed. A glistening mass of black scales, a mouth full of serrated teeth. Talia shoved Riel down just as the creature lunged. Zayn fired. The plasma bolt tore through the night, striking the beast's side. It shrieked, but didn't fall. Instead, it whirled with terrifying speed, its tail slamming into him with the force of a battering ram. Pain exploded through his ribs as he hit the ground. Talia was already moving, a curved blade flashing in her hand. She lunged at the creature, her blade sinking deep into its exposed flank. The wound didn't bleed. Instead, the creature let out a guttural, horrifying laugh. Zayn pushed himself up, dazed. That wasn't an animal. It was something else entirely. Talia snarled. ripping her dagger free and flipping backward just as the creature swiped at her. She landed lightly on her feet, her movements unnaturally fluid. Zayn barely had time to process it before the beast turned its attention back to him. It lunged. He barely dodged, rolling aside as its claws raked the ground where he had been. He fired again, this time at its head. The shot landed. The creature howled in agony, staggering back. Talia didn't waste a second. She sprang forward, moving so fast she was almost a blur, and drove her blade straight through its throat. The beast let out a final gurgling snarl, then collapsed. Silence. Zayn lay on his back, breathing hard. His pulse was still pounding in his ears, but his mind was catching up. The markings. The unnatural speed. The glowing silver eyes. He turned his head to look at Talia. She stood over the corpse, her blade dripping with something that looked like ink instead of blood. Her hands were trembling. Zayn sat up slowly. You want to tell me what the hell that was? Talia didn't answer right away. She wiped her blade clean, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to him. Her voice was eerily calm. They scented me. Zayn narrowed his eyes. Who? She hesitated. Then, softly. The ones who cursed me. A shiver ran down Zayn's spine. Not from the cold. Not from the pain in his ribs. But because, for the first time since he had set foot on this planet, he wasn't sure curses weren't real. The corpse of the beast still steamed where it lay, its black scales glistening with the unnatural sheen of something not quite organic. The air was thick with the stench of burnt flesh and ozone from Zayn's plasma shots. Zayn pushed himself to his feet, ribs aching with the effort. His gaze flickered to Talia, who stood rigid, her blade still gripped tight in her fist. The markings on her arms had dulled, their eerie glow fading back into her skin, but he had seen them pulse, move, as if alive. He didn't believe in curses, but he had seen enough to know when something wasn't right. Talia turned toward him, her silver eyes unreadable. We have to move. Zayn exhaled, nodding. Yeah, no argument there. He glanced toward Riel. The boy had pressed himself against the broken wall of the ruined outpost, his small hands curled into fists. But he wasn't crying, wasn't shaking. He was watching, silent, unblinking, like he had seen this before. Zayn's stomach twisted. What the hell was that thing? He asked, voice low. Talia hesitated for only a moment. A Severic hound, she said finally. They don't hunt alone. Zayn's grip tightened on his rifle. Great. He turned toward the darkness beyond the ruins, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. And these Severic hounds, they're hunting you? Talia's jaw tensed. They always have. The way she said it, steady, resigned, unsettled him more than the beast itself. She wasn't just running from a colony that had abandoned her. She had been running for a long time. A sound drifted through the ruins, low, almost melodic. A whisper of a voice that wasn't there. The hairs on the back of Zayn's neck stood on end. Riel stirred, his silver eyes darting to Talia. They're calling, he murmured, voice barely above a breath. Zayn stiffened. Talia's expression didn't change, but her fingers flexed at her sides. Ignore it. But Zayn heard it now. A voice, not quite human, not quite real, threading through the ruins like a song carried on the wind. He had been in 100 battlefields, had faced death more times than he could count. He knew fear when he felt it. This was something else. His rifle was steady, but his pulse wasn't. Talia turned sharply, her cloak billowing behind her. We leave now. Zayn didn't argue. He moved to Riel, offering a hand, but the boy only stared at him. His expression was blank, expectant, like he was waiting for something, or someone. Talia grabbed Riel's wrist, pulling him close, and turned away. Keep up, Voss. Zayn followed, pulse hammering. Behind them, the whispering voices faded into the wind. For now, they moved fast, navigating the ruined colony with practiced efficiency. Talia led without hesitation, her path weaving through crumbling streets and collapsed structures as if she had done this 1,000 times before. Zayn kept his rifle raised, scanning the darkness for movement. His ribs still ached, but he ignored it. Pain could be dealt with later. The only thing that mattered now was getting off this cursed rock. Tell me there's a ship, he muttered. There's a ship, Talia said flatly. Zayn narrowed his eyes. That wasn't convincing. Talia didn't look at him. It's old, he swore under his breath. How old? She hesitated. Old. Fantastic. They reached the outskirts of the colony. where the land dipped into a dry riverbed filled with rusted-out transport husks and abandoned machinery. A landing platform jutted out over the edge, half collapsed, its skeletal remains creaking in the wind. At the far end of it, partially buried in the sand and debris, was a ship, if you could call it that. Zayn let out a slow breath. I take it back. That's not old. That's dead. The vessel was a cargo hauler, probably pre-war, judging by the rusted hull and obsolete design. Its landing struts were half buried in the dirt, and entire sections of the outer plating had been stripped away. You have got to be kidding me. Talia ignored him, climbing onto the platform. It'll fly. Zayn followed, running a hand over the rusted surface of the hull. Will it? She didn't answer. Instead, she placed a palm against the ship's interface panel. The metal beneath her fingers flickered. A pulse of light ran through the ship's dead systems, spreading like veins of fire through the rusted circuits. The engine, long since dormant, gave a weak, sputtering whine. Zayn stiffened. Talia closed her eyes. The markings on her arms pulsed once, just for a second. And the ship sighed. A sound that wasn't mechanical. A sound that was alive. Zayn stepped back. What the hell? The ship's lights flickered erratically. The main control console sparked. Then, a voice filled the air. Recognized. Zayn froze. The voice wasn't human. Wasn't entirely artificial, either. It was something in between. Talia exhaled. It still remembers me. Zayn shot her a sharp look. You want to explain why your ship talks like a ghost? She glanced at him. Not really. Of course not. The ship groaned as its systems came back online. Dust and sand shook loose from its frame, the lights flickering like a machine coming back to life after a long slumber. Riel, still silent, pressed his small hands against the hull. And the ship hummed. A low, melodic vibration that made Zayn's gut twist. No ship should sound like that. Zayn dragged a hand down his face. I'm getting real tired of things whispering at me. Talia pressed a few commands into the console. Get inside. Zayn hesitated. His instincts were screaming at him. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. And yet, the colony was dead. Something had sent those creatures after them. Something was still watching. And if they stayed, they were going to die. So he sighed, adjusted his rifle, and stepped into the ghost ship. It smelled of old metal and lost time. The corridors were dimly lit, the walls humming softly beneath his fingers. There was something unsettling about it, something half alive, half forgotten. He turned to Talia. All right, he muttered. I'll bite. He gestured to the glowing circuits, the whispering echoes in the walls. What the hell is this ship? Talia met his gaze, and for the first time, there was something like hesitation in her silver eyes. It was never just a ship. The deck rumbled beneath them. Outside, the wind howled, and in the dark recesses of Veris Prime, something whispered their names. The ship shuddered, its ancient systems stirring like something roused from a long and uneasy slumber. Zayn Voss stood in the dimly lit corridor, listening to the low hum pulsing beneath the metal plating. It wasn't just the engines powering up, it was something deeper, something wrong. Talia moved through the ship with practiced ease, her fingertips brushing against the walls as if listening for something. Riel stayed close behind her, silent as ever, his silver eyes flickering with an understanding Zayn didn't like. This ship knew them, and that was a problem. Zayn adjusted his grip on his rifle, his instincts screaming at him to walk away, to turn back, to run. But there was nowhere to go. Veris Prime was dead. The things that hunted them weren't. Talia stopped at the cockpit entrance, her silhouette framed by the soft, flickering glow of the control panels. The consoles were sleek, yet outdated, designed long before Zayn's time. He had seen hundreds of ships across the outer reaches, but nothing quite like this. He stepped forward warily. So, are you going to tell me what exactly I just walked into? Talia pressed a few commands into the console, her expression unreadable. You walked into a graveyard, she said. Zayn's gut tightened. Yeah, I noticed. What I haven't noticed is why this rusted heap suddenly came back to life when you touched it. Talia's silver eyes flicked to his, calm and unreadable. Because it knows me. Zayn let out a slow breath, glancing around the cockpit. That's not an answer. That's a riddle. Talia didn't respond. The ship's internal lights flickered. Then the voice returned. Recognized. Talia Sarai. Bloodline confirmed. Zayn went rigid. Riel, still standing by the doorway, didn't flinch. The ship sighed. You have returned. Zayn turned sharply to Talia. The hell is that? Talia exhaled, placing both hands on the controls. The flickering lights stabilized. The hum of the ship deepened, shifting from an eerie whisper to something steadier. I told you, she murmured. It was never just a ship. Zayn stepped forward, his pulse pounding. Then what is it? Talia hesitated. Then, it's a prison. Silence fell between them. Zayn frowned. For what? Talia looked down at the controls, her hands flexing over the worn metal. For something that should have stayed buried. Zayn's fingers twitched toward his rifle. You're going to have to be a lot more specific than that, Sarai. Talia let out a slow breath. The marked weren't just feared for our powers. We weren't just hunted. She turned to face him fully, the low blue glow from the console casting sharp shadows across her features. We were made. Zayn's blood ran cold. He had heard stories about the marked ones. People whispered about them in darkened outposts, claiming they brought ruin wherever they went. Some said they had been cursed by the gods. Others said they were a genetic experiment gone wrong, an old war's forgotten project. He had never believed in curses. But now, standing on this thing, he wasn't sure he believed in much of anything anymore. This ship, Talia continued, was one of the last containment vessels, a place where my kind were locked away, sealed, before the war ended. Zayn swore under his breath. Then why the hell would they leave it on Veris Prime? Talia's silver eyes gleamed. They didn't. The deck beneath them lurched. Zayn staggered, gripping the back of the pilot's chair as the ship groaned to life. Dust fell from the ceiling panels. The lights flared, then dimmed again. Riel, still quiet, reached out a small hand and placed it against the wall. The ship breathed. Zayn stiffened. He had fought in enough battles to recognize a war machine when he saw one. But this wasn't a machine. It was something else. Something alive. He turned to Talia. Tell me this thing isn't waking up whatever's locked inside it. Talia hesitated. Then, a voice, not the ship's, but something older, something deeper, slithered through the speakers. The seal is weak. Zayn felt his stomach drop. She has returned. The cockpit lights flickered again, static crackling through the air. The entire ship shuddered, as if something was moving inside the walls. Something waiting. Something hungry. Talia's fingers flew over the controls, her movements quick and precise. We need to get off the ground. Now. Zayn didn't argue. He moved to the co-pilot's chair, scanning the navigation system. The star maps were ancient, outdated. Most of the known space sectors weren't even charted yet. Because this ship wasn't meant to travel. It was meant to stay buried. A warning blared across the console. Containment breach detected. Zayn's hands clenched. Talia, whatever this thing is. Not now, she snapped. The ship's engines roared to life. The dust-covered thrusters, long dormant, sputtered before igniting in a blast of heat and energy. The entire vessel lurched, fighting against years of decay, struggling to rise. Outside, the ground trembled. Then, from the ruins of Veris Prime, the whispering voices returned. She is awake. The darkness beyond the ship shifted. Figures, half seen, flickering like echoes of something that didn't belong in this reality, began to emerge from the ruins. Zayn's pulse hammered. Tell me you see that. Talia's hands tightened on the controls. I see it. Riel, still touching the wall, whispered. They've come for her. The ship's alarm blared. Containment failure imminent. Zayn's breath caught. The engine screamed. The ground split open. Something moved beneath the ruins, something vast. Something waiting. And then, the ship broke free. With a final, deafening roar, the ancient vessel tore itself from Veris Prime's surface, the gravitational pull fighting against it until they were in the air. Then the stars. Then silence. Zayn slumped back in his seat, his pulse still racing. He turned to Talia, who was gripping the controls so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Well, he muttered. That could have gone worse. Talia exhaled shakily. Then, for the first time since they met, she looked afraid. It's not over. Zayn glanced at the ship's flickering display. The words flashing across the screen sent a cold shiver down his spine. Containment failure, 13%. He didn't know what was locked inside this thing. But whatever it wasn't going to stay locked for long. The ship drifted through the void, silent but not still. Zayn Voss sat in the co-pilot's chair, staring at the words flickering across the console. Containment failure, 13%. The percentage was rising. Slowly, steadily. Talia Sarai sat across from him. Her silver eyes locked on the display, her fingers gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. He'd seen her fight without fear, seen her slit the throat of a monster without flinching. But now, for the first time, she looked afraid. Zayn swallowed. Talia. She didn't look at him. Talia, what the hell does that mean? She exhaled through her nose. It means, she said carefully, that the ship wasn't just a prison. Zayn waited. She turned toward him, her expression unreadable. It was a coffin. A muscle in Zayn's jaw twitched. For what? Talia hesitated. Then, the lights flickered. A sound, soft, distant, echoed through the ship. A whisper, threading through the metal, moving inside the walls. Zayn stiffened. Talia. I know. He reached for his rifle. The sound grew louder. Zayn had heard whispering before, on Veris Prime, when the shadows had watched them. This was different. This wasn't something calling from the outside. This was inside. Something was waking up. A dull thump echoed through the ship. Then another. Then another. Zayn swung his rifle toward the sound, pulse hammering. That's coming from the cargo hold, he muttered. Talia was already moving. Stay with Riel. Zayn grabbed her arm before she could pass. Like hell. I'm coming with you. She stared at him. He stared back. Finally, she nodded once. They moved quickly, weaving through the dim corridors. The hum of the ship had changed, less mechanical, more alive. Zayn wasn't sure if it was his imagination, but the walls almost breathed. The whispering followed them. They reached the cargo hold. Talia keyed in the override. The door hissed open. Cold air rushed out. Zayn raised his rifle. The hold was dark, shadowed, and yet, in the very center of the room, something moved. Something small. Zayn exhaled sharply. Riel. The boy was standing in the middle of the cargo bay, barefoot, his cloak pooling around him. His silver eyes glowed faintly in the dark. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting. Talia took a step forward. Riel, she said carefully. What are you doing? The boy didn't answer. Zayn felt his grip tighten on his weapon. The air felt wrong. Heavy, charged with something just beyond his understanding. The whispering grew louder. And then, the shadows behind Riel shifted. Something unfolded from the darkness. A shape, wrong in ways Zayn couldn't fully process. It was there, but not, flickering between reality and something else, something older. Zayn's blood ran cold. He had fought creatures before. He had stared down mercenaries, warlords, things with claws and teeth and hunger. But this wasn't alive. It was a memory of something that had been, and it was watching them. Riel turned slightly, his silver eyes unreadable. She's coming, he murmured. Talia's breath hitched. Zayn barely had time to react before the thing in the dark moved. The shadows coiled, stretching across the floor, reaching for them like tendrils of ink bleeding into the world. Talia shoved Riel back. Run. The boy didn't move. Zayn fired. The plasma bolt streaked through the darkness, then vanished. Swallowed. Like the ship itself had eaten the light. Zayn's pulse spiked. That's new. The whispering crescendoed. And then, a figure stepped forward. Zayn's breath caught. She was tall. Taller than any human should be. Her form impossibly slender, draped in something that wasn't fabric but the shifting substance of the void itself. Her eyes burned like twin silver stars, her skin deep blue, like Talia's, but wrong. Unnatural. Markings covered her arms, the same ones as Talia's. But they weren't dormant. They moved. Zayn saw them twist and coil, breathing against her flesh, as if something inside her was alive. Talia was frozen. Her lips parted, but no words came. The woman smiled. Little sister. Zayn's blood ran cold. The woman took another step forward. Her voice was a whisper, threading through the air, wrapping around them like silk. You can't run from this. Talia's entire body went rigid. You're dead. The woman smiled wider. Am I? Zayn took a step forward, placing himself between them. I don't know who the hell you are, but if you try anything. The woman's silver gaze flicked to him, and something pressed against his mind. It wasn't touch. It wasn't a voice. It was existence. He saw things. A battlefield, filled with the broken bodies of the marked. A machine, ancient and vast, carving its will into their flesh. A war, not of men, but of something greater. He staggered. Talia caught his arm. Zayn. The woman tilted her head. You're not ready. And then, she vanished. Not like someone stepping away. Like someone who had never been there at all. The whispering stopped. The ship was silent. Zayn exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. He turned to Talia. You want to tell me what the hell that was? Talia swallowed. Then, softly, my sister. Zayn stared. You're what? Talia let out a shaky breath. She's been dead for years. Zayn exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. Yeah? Well, hate to break it to you, Sarai, but she doesn't look very dead to me. Talia didn't respond. Because she knew. Zayn turned to Riel. The boy was still watching. Still waiting. Zayn's stomach twisted. You knew, didn't you? Riel tilted his head. She was always coming. Zayn swallowed. Talia's voice was barely above a whisper. She's not done. The ship groaned. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the vessel, the whispering began again. The whispering didn't stop. It pulsed through the ship like a heartbeat. Low, rhythmic, crawling through the metal and into the bones of the vessel. Into them. Zayn Voss sat in the dim cockpit, his rifle resting against his knee, eyes locked on the flickering containment warning. 16% now. Rising. Always rising. Across from him, Talia Sarai stood stiffly, staring at nothing, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She had barely spoken since the encounter in the cargo hold. Since her sister, her dead sister, had stepped out of the void like she had never left. Zayn had questions. A hell of a lot of them. But first, we need a plan, he said flatly. Talia blinked, dragging herself back to the present. A plan. Yeah. You know, that thing you do before something tries to kill you. Talia let out a slow breath. You think we can plan for this? Zayn gestured toward the console. I think we have to. Talia exhaled through her nose, stepping closer. The dim light from the control panels cast sharp shadows across her face. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked uncertain. Zayn leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Let's start simple. Your sister. Talia flinched, just slightly, but he caught it. She's dead, she murmured. Clearly not, Zayn muttered. Talia's hands curled into fists. I saw her die. Zayn frowned. How? Talia hesitated. Then, softly, she died in the war. Zayn sat back. What war? Talia's silver eyes flicked to his. The one no one remembers. Zayn felt something cold settle in his gut. The marked, Talia continued, weren't always hunted. We were made. And we were made for one reason. Zayn watched her carefully. To fight. Talia nodded. Zayn exhaled sharply. He had heard stories, whispers of an old war on the fringes of space, one that never made it into the history records. Something about rogue genetic experiments, a lost fleet, colonies that vanished without a trace. No official reports. No memorials. Just the kind of stories drunk mercenaries muttered in dim-lit outposts before falling silent. Because even rumors could get you killed. And your sister? He asked carefully. Talia's throat bobbed. She was stronger than me. Her voice was quiet, distant. She led us. Zayn frowned. Then why, who? She died, Talia snapped, her silver eyes flashing. She died. And I buried her. The ship groaned. The whispering deepened. Riel, sitting quietly at the edge of the cockpit, didn't move, didn't flinch. Then, softly. She's not the only one who's coming. Zayn stiffened. Talia turned sharply. Riel, what are you? A proximity alarm blared. Zayn spun to the controls. Multiple signatures. Fast approach. Zayn's blood ran cold. That's not random. Talia didn't hesitate. Strap in. Zayn barely made it to the co-pilot's seat before the ship lurched. Engines flared. Outside, in the endless stretch of deep space, they came. The ships appeared all at once. No warning. No radio signals. Just shadows tearing into real space, their hulls black against the void. Moving with a precision that sent an instinctive, primal fear through Zayn's chest. They weren't scavengers. Weren't mercenaries. They were something else. Zayn barely had time to register their shape before the targeting alarm screamed. Evasive now. Talia jerked the controls. The ship twisted violently, engines roaring, the bulkhead groaning in protest. A barrage of plasma fire ripped through space where they had just been. Zayn gritted his teeth. Who the hell are they? Talia's fingers flew over the controls. Not friendly. Zayn had already figured that part out. The enemy ships were sleek, their hulls adorned with markings, her markings. The same dark, swirling patterns that had once coiled along Talia's arms. Zayn's stomach twisted. Talia, he said carefully, why do their ships look like you? Talia didn't answer. The ship rocked violently as another blast skimmed past their shields. Zayn swore. I swear, if you don't start explaining things before we... A voice crackled through the comms. Cold. Measured. You cannot outrun what you are, Sarai. Talia's hands shook on the controls. Zayn inhaled sharply, because he knew that voice. The sister. The woman from the void. Zayn clenched his fists. Talia. Talia was breathing too fast. The comms flickered again. The war never ended. A second fleet dropped from hyperspace. Zayn's stomach dropped with it. This wasn't a fight. This was a capture. A hunt. Talia's voice was barely audible. We're not getting out of this. Zayn clenched his jaw. The hell we aren't. Talia shook her head, fingers gripping the ship's worn edges. You don't understand. Zayn leaned forward, voice low. Dangerous. Then make me understand. Talia exhaled shakily. Then, finally, I was never meant to leave Veris Prime. The words hit like a gunshot. Zayn stared. What? Talia swallowed. That shipwreck? She murmured. The one we escaped from? Zayn nodded slowly. Talia exhaled. It wasn't wrecked. Zayn's pulse hammered. Talia's silver eyes were haunted. They put me there. Zayn's breath caught. And the whispering voices laughed. The fleet surrounded them. Engines burned. The past had come to collect its debts. And they were out of time. The enemy fleet surrounded them, silent and patient, like a pack of predators waiting for the inevitable. Talia's fingers trembled on the controls. The ship's engine burned hot, but she wasn't moving. Because there was nowhere to run. Zayn Voss could feel it. This wasn't an ambush. It wasn't an attack. It was a reclamation. They had come for her. The comms crackled. The voice that had haunted the cargo hold, that had whispered from the void, returned. You were never meant to leave, Talia. Zayn clenched his fists. Talia inhaled sharply, her silver eyes locked on the ships beyond the viewport. They sent you to die, Zayn murmured. Didn't they? She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Zayn felt something cold settle in his chest. Veris Prime had never been abandoned. It had been a containment site. Talia wasn't just a fugitive. She was an escapee. Riel, quiet until now, spoke. They won't let her go. Zayn turned sharply. The boy sat cross-legged by the bulkhead, watching the fleet with eerie calm. His silver eyes flickered in the dim light. Zayn exhaled. I got that part, kid. The comms crackled again. Step forward, Talia's Sarai. Talia's jaw clenched. Zayn raised his rifle. Yeah, I'm gonna vote no on that one. Talia barely reacted. She was too still. Zayn recognized that kind of stillness. It was the kind of stillness before a soldier stepped onto a battlefield they knew they wouldn't leave. He swore under his breath. She was going to surrender. Zayn moved before he could think. He grabbed Talia's wrist, yanking her toward him. Her eyes snapped to his. Don't, he said. Her lips parted. Zayn. Don't even think about it. Her expression twisted, anger, frustration, something else buried beneath. They won't stop. I don't care. Her hands clenched into fists. It's me they want. Yeah. Zayn shot back. Then they can burn. Talia exhaled sharply. Riel watched them, unblinking. The comms crackled again. If you do not comply, we will take the child. The air went still. Zayn saw it happen, saw the way Talia's face broke for the smallest fraction of a second. They knew. They knew. Zayn's grip tightened. His voice was low. Steady. You don't have to do this. Talia's silver eyes met his. They were fierce. Resigned. And then, she let go. She tore herself from his grip and stepped toward the viewport. Talia. She placed a hand against the cold glass. The fleet outside was waiting. Then, softly. I fought them once, she whispered. And we lost. Zayn's breath hitched. Talia turned. Her silver eyes burned. And I swore I'd never let it happen again. Then the markings on her arms flared. The ship screamed. The ship lurched. Alarms blared. Systems overloaded. Zayn barely kept his balance as the deck shook beneath them. Talia wasn't moving. The markings on her arms spread, creeping like liquid ink, curling up her throat, along her jaw, shifting, writhing, changing. Zayn's pulse spiked. Talia. She gasped sharp and raw as something tore open in the space around them. The ship's whispering voices rose in a chorus. And outside, the fleet froze. For the first time since they arrived, their ships hesitated. Zayn saw it, on the flickering monitors, on the tactical readout. They weren't advancing anymore. They were waiting. Then, a tear split the void behind them. Something stepped through. Zayn felt it before he saw it. A presence vast and suffocating. Cold, endless, wrong. Then the shadows moved. And she arrived. The sister. The woman from the cargo hold. The woman from Talia's past. She stepped through the rift in space, untouched by the laws of physics, by time, by anything human. Her silver eyes gleamed. Her voice was a whisper. Welcome home, little sister. Zayn raised his rifle. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. The woman from the void stood before them, her silver eyes like twin dying stars, pulling the air from the room, the life from it. She was wrong. Not in the way that monsters were wrong, with claws and hunger and blood in their teeth. She was wrong in a way that broke the laws of existence. A thing that shouldn't be here. A thing that shouldn't be at all. Zayn Voss kept his rifle raised, even though he had the sinking feeling that it wouldn't do a damn thing. Across the cockpit, Talia stood frozen. Not in fear. Not even in shock. But in recognition. Honora, she breathed. The woman, her sister, smiled. You still remember? The whisper of her voice curled around the air, around the ship, around them, like fingers pressing against their minds. Zayn tightened his grip on his rifle. Talia, he muttered. What is that? Honora's silver eyes flickered to him. And for a moment, just a moment, Zayn felt himself slip. Not physically. Not like being shoved. Like being pulled sideways into something vast and endless and cold. A battlefield of screaming bodies, twisted metal, ships burning in the void. A laboratory filled with broken things that had once been human. A war, so ancient, so forgotten, that it had been erased from history. Zayn ripped himself back. His pulse hammered. His vision swam. Honora's smile widened. Ah, she murmured, tilting her head. You're strong. Zayn swallowed against the nausea clawing at his gut. Yeah, he said hoarsely. Not strong enough to like whatever the hell that was. Talia stepped forward. Her fists were clenched. Her markings burned. This isn't real, she said. Honora blinked. Isn't it? Talia's breath was unsteady. I buried you. Honora sighed, as if mildly disappointed. You did. Zayn exhaled sharply. Well, that's comforting. Honora's gaze flicked back to him. You should run, human. Zayn's stomach turned cold. Because there was no threat in her voice. Only certainty. And Zayn had fought enough wars to know what that meant. They weren't prepared for this. Not even close. The fleet outside hadn't attacked yet. That was the part that bothered Zayn the most. The ships still held position, surrounding them like silent sentinels, waiting for something. For her. Zayn stole a glance at the console. Containment breach, 21%. Still rising. His jaw tightened. Talia, he muttered under his breath. Whatever's going on here, you need to end it. Fast. Talia's silver eyes flickered. She took another step toward Honora. Her voice was low, barely above a breath. You're not her. Honora's expression didn't change. Talia swallowed. I buried her. Honora tilted her head. Yes. Talia's hands shook. Then what are you? For the first time, Honora's expression shifted. Something like amusement. Something like hunger. The war never ended, little sister. Zayn's breath caught. Honora lifted a hand. The walls of the ship shuddered. The air curled inward. Zayn's body locked up. Not just him, Talia too. The ship itself. Riel, still standing by the bulkhead, didn't move. Zayn's pulse spiked. Because Riel wasn't frozen. He was watching. Waiting. Like he had expected this all along. And then, he spoke. You can't take her. The ship screamed. The whispering voices, the ones that had haunted the ship since Veris Prime, rose in a chorus. Honora's silver eyes snapped to Riel. And for the first time since she had stepped from the void, she hesitated. Zayn barely had time to process it before Riel lifted his small hand. And the entire ship turned against her. The walls of the vessel rippled like liquid metal. The air pulsed. The whispering turned to a roar. The fleet outside moved. Not to attack. To retreat. Honora's expression darkened. You were meant to be dead. Riel stared at her. And for the first time since Zayn had met the boy, he smiled. So were you. The ship detonated light. The void swallowed Honora whole. Silence. Zayn gasped, pulling in a ragged breath. His body was his again. His limbs, his mind. The oppressive weight that had pressed against his skull, against his soul, was gone. Honora was gone. The fleet was gone. But the whispering remained. Not from the ship. From Riel. Zayn turned slowly. The boy stood exactly where he had before, his silver eyes still glowing faintly in the dim light. His expression was blank. Like he had expected this. Like he had done this before. Talia was breathing hard. She turned to him, her voice raw. Riel. I told you, the boy said softly. They were always coming. Zayn's stomach twisted. Riel tilted his head. And they'll come again. Zayn's pulse hammered. Kid, he said slowly. What the hell are you? The boy blinked. And smiled. The last of them. Zayn Voss had never believed in fate. He had seen too many men die in wars they never should have fought, seen good people fall for no reason other than bad luck. But as he stood in the silent cockpit of a ship that shouldn't exist, staring at a boy who had just banished something from the void, he wasn't so sure anymore. Riel was still smiling, small and knowing. And Zayn hated it, because he had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who had already made a choice. Talia, her silver eyes still wide with disbelief, took a slow step toward the child. Riel, she said carefully. What do you mean? Riel tilted his head. His voice was quiet. I mean, it's over. Zayn's stomach twisted. Over how? Riel's silver eyes gleamed. She won't come back. The ship groaned. The whispering had faded. The weight in the air, the unnatural stillness, the feeling of being watched, was gone. Zayn let out a slow breath. They had won. They had survived. Then why did it feel wrong? Talia crouched in front of Riel, placing gentle hands on his small shoulders. She was shaking. Riel, she whispered. Tell me what you did. The boy hesitated. Just for a second. Then, softly. I sent her away. Zayn frowned. Where? Riel blinked up at him. And then, the ship screamed. Containment breach, 48%. Zayn's blood went cold. No, he breathed. Talia turned sharply to the console. It's still climbing. Zayn's pulse spiked. I thought you said it was over, kid. Riel didn't answer. Talia's silver eyes widened. Zayn, she whispered. She wasn't the breach. Zayn's stomach plummeted. Then, the ship lurched. The metal beneath their feet warped. Something else was waking up. And it wasn't Honora. It had never been Honora. Zayn grabbed Riel's wrist. What did you do? Riel finally looked at him. For the first time. For the first time since Zayn had met the boy. He looked scared. His voice broke. I didn't know. Zayn's hands clenched. Didn't know what? The ship tore itself apart. Zayn was falling. No, they all were. The ship wasn't breaking physically. It was breaking out of reality. The walls unraveled into nothing, the metal stretching and folding into the void. Zayn reached for Talia. She was already reaching for him. Their hands clasped. Riel wasn't falling. He was standing in the middle of it all, watching as the ship came undone. And Zayn understood. Too late. The war wasn't over. It had never been over. The ship had never been just a prison. It was a door. And now, it was open. Talia's voice was raw. Riel. The boy smiled. And it broke Zayn's heart. Because it wasn't the smile of a child. It was the smile of a sacrifice. I can close it, Riel whispered. Talia froze. Zayn's chest ached. No, Talia rasped. We'll find another way. Riel shook his head. Soft. Understanding. There is no other way. Zayn knew he was right. But he couldn't accept it. He refused to. Talia stepped forward. The void cracked. She couldn't reach him. Riel looked at her. Really looked at her. His silver eyes shimmered. You gave me a home, he whispered. Talia broke. Riel. His small fingers curled into fists. He looked at Zayn. At Talia. At the only family he had ever known. And then, he stepped back. Into the light. The universe collapsed. Silence. Cold. Dark. And then, air. Zayn gasped, his body slamming into the floor. Not metal. Not void. Something real. Something solid. He coughed, breathed, his lungs burning. Then he felt her. Talia was on her knees beside him, her body shaking, her silver eyes wide. She turned, frantic, searching for Riel. But the ship was gone. The void was gone. The whispering was gone. And Riel was gone. Talia's lips parted. She inhaled sharply, once, twice, and screamed. It was raw. It was endless. It was grief. Zayn clenched his fists. Because he had lost people before. But this felt unforgivable. Time passed. How long? Zayn didn't know. The stars stretched before them, vast and cold. Talia hadn't spoken since it happened. Not once. She sat by the viewport, staring at nothing. Her silver eyes were empty. Zayn swallowed. He pulled something from his pocket. A flower. Small. Red. Talia had kept it for so long. Tucked into her cloak, pressed close to her heart. Now, she didn't notice as he set it beside her. She didn't move. Didn't blink. Zayn sat beside her. He didn't speak, because there was nothing to say. They had won, and they had lost, and there was no coming back from this. The war was over, but the cost had been everything. And somewhere, in the void between worlds, a boy who had never belonged closed the door behind him.